Hello and welcome everyone to the 75 Days of Partition Daily Podcast. Today is day 50 and I'm super excited today to welcome Professor Arupjyoti Saikia. So Professor Saikia, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yes.
Professor Saikia, okay. We're going to be discussing such an interesting topic that is so little discussed in the world of partition studies and is just coming to light. It's what exactly happened in the East. And before we get started, I would like to read your bio here for our viewers. So Professor Arupjyoti Saikia teaches in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Indian Institute of Technology, Guwahati. His teaching and research interests include the environment, economic and political history of modern Assam. His published works include Forests and the Ecological History of Assam and A Century of Protests, Peasants' Politics in Assam since 1900, and The Unquiet River, a biography of Brahmaputra. His entire biography is quite long, so we're going to post it under the video, and I really encourage you to read it. I'm so excited to have you here today. And since, our work and our podcast really focus on the individual, so I want to focus today both on you as an individual and also your work. So what personal connection, if any, or interest brought you into the world of partition studies?
I think it is a great honor to be part of this program, and we have been following and reading, and I've learned personally from this particular program, from this project for a really long time. Many of my students, they also do follow this program very seriously, and they are all enthused by this program. I don't think at the very personal level, I do have any direct connections with those some part of the partition story. But I think it is a larger locational interest. The place that I do come from, the kind of historical research that I'm interested in, and the broad time period that I do engage with. I think these are the questions which brought me to understand this question of partition. Uh, in fact, for a long period of time, the partition has always been seen as a story centered around two major provinces of British India, Bengal and Punjab, and which is rightly so. But there are also major political, economic, cultural, intellectual outcomes, right, resulting out of this partition story. More importantly, it is the questions that Assam faced subsequent in this time of the partition or in the independent India about its economy. I think these are the broad questions which took me and many of my students to the stories or the devastations caused by the 1947.
One question I was going to ask, can you tell us a little bit about, the eastern boundaries, both between Assam and, say, Bangladesh, but also the east, the very eastern boundaries with Burma? Were there any impacts during partition? We don't hear about it as much as, compared to the Punjab boundary and the Bengal boundary.
In fact, the three boundaries that came into more institutional form, or there has been more interest that was generated post 1947. One is that of the boundary with East Pakistan, and which actually touched several Indian states, Meghalaya, Tripura, then also Assam quite substantially, and then India and also the Burma boundary. That has also been questions contested, and it was negotiated diplomatically, politically for a really long period of time. And also India's boundary at the northern side, the eastern Himalaya, the boundary with China, I think, that has remained definitely a complex historical and political questions. We are not dealing with that story in this discussion. But here, the question of the boundary between Bangladesh, East Pakistan, and Burma that acquired a new and complex shape around this period, 1947, in the later period of time. I think But what exactly happened during the partition 1947? Suddenly one part of the country, which was really important from the perspective of the British capital investment, Britain invested quite heavily in these regions. So these regions suffered quite seriously and massively in terms of its disengagement with and dislodging of its resources, both in terms of the human as well as other capital infrastructure or other kind of infrastructures, right? Everything got disrupted because of this partition. But this story essentially began a little bit earlier, right? The kind of partition that we saw in Punjab or in Bangladesh was clear, right?
Right.
Massive flows of the human mobilities, right? Human migrations, sufferings, and the tortures, everything happened in the other two boundaries. But here, the stories emerge quite differently and quite silently.
So
I
can you
think
tell
that
us a little bit about that? What was different and how did the story emerge?
I think there are two distinct stories. One, suddenly the Assam's own geography got changed, right? Assam was one of the largest British Indian province before independence, with almost 80,000 square kilometer, 80,000 square kilometer, right? It was really quite big, but suddenly the whole boundary or geographical shape of Assam got changed because of this partition. It essentially came on the 3rd of June, 1947. On the 3rd of June 1947, when Mountbatten announced India's future partition, that India would be
Right.
divided, he also declared one thing, that two Indian districts would be there would be referendum. One would be in the northwest frontier province, and one would be the Sylhet district of Assam. Sylhet was actually the sandwich between the two different identities. One is that of the Bengali identity and that of the Assam's own anxieties with the Sylhet thing. And when finally a referendum took place on the 6th and 7th of July 1947, about which a lot of literary works, a lot of historical and other works have been written, both in modern Bangladesh, in Bengal, and in Assam also. That actually created enormous amount of anxiety for that region. Not anxiety, tensions, political conflicts, troubles, everything actually began happen around the later part of June 1947 and the first 2 weeks of July 1947.
And what was the referendum exactly? Can you explain that to our viewers who may not understand?
Okay, right. You know, Sylhet was essentially almost 50-50 Hindu-Muslim district of modern Assam, right? Sylhet was part of East Bengal, and it was ruled by the British East India Company from the late 18th century. But in between, it was almost like a pendulum. Sometime it would be part of Bengal, sometime it would be part of Assam. And the political orientations of the communities also got kept on shifting for quite a long period of time. But in 1947, the message was very clear which side the Sylhet would be. It was a district of Assam, but now what would be its future? Mountbatten decided that a referendum would take place to decide the future course of actions. Let the people of the Sylhet district take a decisions. So when the election took place, several things happened. First, the Hindus essentially they voted in support of being retained, being in India. That means they will remain part of Assam. But the Muslims, they thought because of political and because of the circumstances of those days, for a long period of time, the Muslims of Sylhet, they were not in favor of going to Bengal. They wanted to be part of Assam. But now, in the new circumstances of partitions and the other kind of frenzies created by the pre-partition days politics, finally, the majority decided to be part of East Pakistan. That is decided now. But the question emerged how the boundaries will be decided now for Sylhet, right? The, the Sylhet have decided that it will become part of East Pakistan. Now, how the boundaries will be drawn, right? Will the entire this Muslim-dominated districts of Assam will be now part of this Sylhet referendum, or whether they will be also part of East Pakistan, or only Sylhet and the adjoining villages and adjoining areas of Sylhet would now be partial out to become part of East Pakistan. These were all decided in a very short period of time, post 14th of July 1947. Before that, there was a lot of tensions. Many Assamese, they actually wanted, Hindu Assamese, they wanted Sylhet not to be part of Assam anymore because there are a lot of anxieties. They thought that Sylhet, because of it, Bengali Hindu dominated areas, there are competition for jobs and other kind of things. So there are already a kind of tensions. But when this particular dispute about the boundary emerged in the second week of July 1947, it became actually big trouble. Nehru, Bordoloi, Gopinath Bordoloi, who was Assam's premier at the time, they all pushed that there should be a separate boundary commission for Assam. But Mountbatten insisted that it cannot be because there is no time. The Bengal Boundary Commission, it should actually take the decision on behalf of Sylhet. The Bengal Boundary Commission, they sat down, took a lot of evidence. People from Assam, people from Sylhet, they all gave evidences before the Bengal Boundary Commission. They actually sat in a place called Alipur in North Bengal, where all these evidences were collected and these evidences were sent to Radcliffe. And finally, the boundary was demarcated, and these final decisions about the entire boundary was declared on the 17th of August, as usual for Punjab and Bengal also. Now, exactly several things happened. Some of the Hindu-dominated thanas, police stations of Sylhet, it was awarded to Assam, right? I think there are 4 major thanas, police stations, which were Hindu-dominated. They were awarded to Assam. But there were reasons for that. It was not only the Hindu majority which decided the Bengal Boundary Commissions to award these police stations to Assam. Because there are interests of the tea plantations, there are interests of forested areas, there are questions of access to the princely state of Tripura. All these things have forced the Bengal Boundary Commissions that this should be essentially given to Assam, right? So some of the modern districts of Assam, like Hailakandi, Karimganj, right, they're all part of Assam. They're essentially some part of it, the Sylhet district, right? They were awarded and they were transferred to the Kasar district of Assam. So this happened exactly around these months of July and August, right? But there are a lot of anxieties, a lot of tensions in these areas.
But so you mean they were officially actually assigning these districts during June and July before August 17th? They were making official announcements?
Yes, no official announcement came on the 17th of August, like okay. Punjab and the other districts of Assam.
So this is more like rumor in the...
Right. But obviously, a lot of Hindu populations in Sylhet, they became unhappy and they tried to pursue this matter for a really long period of time. They wrote to Patel, they wrote to Nehru, but obviously things were more complex and nothing could be done for that community. However, when the partition exactly happened, it was obviously not only a mutilated geography, there are other complex stories that emerged. And it really took some longer period of time, from 1947 till 1950 almost, right, to overcome this crisis. Some of the crises could not be resolved for a much later period of time. When the East Pakistan was created, some of the biggest pressure came on Assam's economy. 3 things that Assam got deprived of now. Assam's connections to mainland India, to the port of Bengal, Bay of Bengal, the vibrant markets and other things were essentially through two major roads. It would be either through the Brahmaputra or the railway networks. It was very closely connected with the railway networks. All this, either the Brahmaputra's lower part or the railway networks, all now became part of East Pakistan. From 1947 till 1950, these disruptions in the traffic, it really created havoc for Assam's heavily industrialized tree industry or other, for example, the jute. Jute was one of the major raw material that was produced. In fact, in the months of 1947, right, in post-rainy seasons, right, jutes really could not be exported from Assam to the jute industries of Bengal because suddenly there was no railway service. There was no river steamer service. Everything was now either got blocked or disruptions. So I think these two major disruptions came in 1947, and it continued to be there well into the 1950. There was no major route connections which would connect Assam and India for a really the whatever rudimentary routes were which connect surface road, which connected Assam to the North Bengal, they were not really in a good shape.
Okay.
Lorries or other kind of transport carriers, they really cannot afford to travel by those roads.
And have you
There are,
heard stories of how this impacted people, how this impacted local populations?
yes, obviously. Can I come back to that a little
Yeah,
bit later?
for sure.
Right.
For sure. Yeah, please continue.
You know what exactly happened? Uh, Much of this route and railway networks, to rebuild this railway and the route networks, you really have to work in the dangerous terrains, particularly these very ferocious rivers coming from the eastern Himalayas through the North Bengal and like Tista and others. They're really very, very powerful rivers. And most of those Indian engineers, they really did not have independent experience of building bridges and other things at that particular moment, right? So it required some amount of sense of new nation building, some kind of independent enterprise, and there are many Indians actually who became part of this project between 1948 and 1950 at a super speed. Bridges were built, routes connections were recovered, and the railways started flying from 1950 onward. In between this 1947 to 1950, as you asked me these very important questions, the general people, particularly the traders, small merchants, uh, the mobile traders, right, the jute farmers, everyone suffered heavily because none of their products were essentially going out. There were no local market to absorb their products. I think this was the biggest disturbance that came in. You know, Not only here, as we go to the south, in the Khasi Jaintia and the Garu Hills, which would later on form in 1972 the Indian state of Meghalaya, right? They actually became much more. They began to face more serious challenges. You know, Most of their root connections, their day-to-day lives were heavily dependent on their trade and commerce with that of East Pakistan or previously East Bengal. For example, many of our day-to-day vegetable requirement, even oranges or the bay leaves, right? Everything would be produced in these Kasi Janja hills, on Garu hills, right? And they would be marketed. They would be sold in the markets of East Bengal or in West Bengal, right? Now suddenly, this entire market got collapsed. By 1947 till 1950, even in the 1950s and the 60s, this root network questions continued to invite attentions. Politicians tried, other bureaucrats tried to minimize these disruptions over a long period of time. So, what I personally feel, the traders, the farmers, small-time workers, right? Everyone suffered very seriously around this particular period of time. There are also other questions. For example, in the Moimonsin district of modern Bangladesh, which was a very powerful, important district of East Pakistan and East Bengal previously at that time, it had a very substantial Garu population. And the Garus wanted to be part of India.
Can you
And
tell us who Garus were?
sorry?
Who were the Garus?
Okay, right. Garus, yes. Modern Meghalaya, it they are primarily dominated by several ethnic communities, tribal communities. Garus are one of them. They were very powerful. They continued to challenge the might of the British Empire throughout the 19th and even in the early 20th centuries. In fact, in 1822, because the Garus were considered as a very, very aggressive, very rebellious, the British had to adopt special regulations, acts to control them. Early in the 20th century, many Garus and their leaders, they very strongly they resisted the onslaught of the British Empire, right? And they fought legal and other kind of cases. I have written elsewhere about their story. But now many of these Garus, right, they were living in the Moimonching district. In May and June 1947, when this idea of partition was almost very clear, many of those Garus living in East Bengal, in the district of Moimonching, they proposed to Bordoloi, Gopinath Bordoloi, who was Assam's premier, as the chief minister was known at the time. He was represented that these Garos, they must be allowed to become part of India, right? However, and Nehru also agreed to the Bordoloi's propositions, the Garos' propositions, but a Radcliffe Commission, they thought that it will be unwise, they could not be transferred to India, right? So this was one of the major reasons, right? This ethnic tensions also emerged, right? And in the 1960s, at a later period of time, this ethnic and religious conflict continued to be part of the many local and micro kind of crisis. So this is one part of the story of, but there are others also.
Can you give us a
For
glimpse of some of the other stories or some of what was happening, say, in Nagaland and other places
okay,
around the East?
the Nagaland story should be seen different from this Bengal story, right?
For sure.
Because Nagaland, Mizoram, Manipur, right? The other side, they have just
Further east.
overcome one major crisis of modern times, which was the Second World War, right? The Second World War just retreated some of the biggest battles of modern times was fought in 1944, right? Kohima and Imphal battle was known as some of the fiercest and battle of modern times. And they have just overcome this crisis during the Second World War, which when the Japanese army visited them, right?
This is 1942 we're talking about, right?
No, the war took place in 1944. The Burma was occupied by Japan in 1942.
Right.
But the Japanese army actually came and had a battle with Allied armies in 1944, right? And right.
Oh, I was just saying, how is that related to what happened in Mizoram? So I wanted to make that connection. And,
Yes, these are the three areas. Mizoram, which was a district of Assam at the time, it was known as the Lusai Hill District, the Naga Hill District. Manipur was a princely state; it was separate, right, including Tripura, right. So the war took place essentially in the two districts of Assam and one princely state, Manipur, Mizoram, and the physical war did not happen in Mizoram, but the local people suffered. So 1944 was not too far from them. So 44, when exactly the boundaries came in 1947, the local populations in Naga Hills, in Lusai Hills, in Manipur, right, their kinship relations, other kind of family relations, trade negotiations, everything continued to remain across the borders also. the people in Burma and those areas, and Naga Hills, Lusai Hills, Manipur, right? They spoke really a complex linguists together, right? In the Tibeto-Burman languages, all of them they do speak, right? So there are many kind of affinities. There are kind of many relations, right? Family relationship, kinships, trade, commerce, right? And very familiar landscape. Now in around 1947, and for a few more years, as India's Ministry of External Affairs, right, they began to demarcate the boundaries along this India's eastern border, right? A lot of people began to express apprehensions because they thought, and these were not really demarcated for a long period of time. It took some time, and in 1947, 48, 49, these were also seen as a kind of really very disturbing area. There are worries of communist infiltration from Burma. There are worries of many other kind of cross-border tensions. In fact, in the 1950s and the 1960s, these issues continued to hog the Indian government really for a long period of time. When the boundaries began to emerge, this essentially happened through diplomatic negotiations, through political negotiations. The people were actually not very clear where their boundaries are. And the actual physical demarcations did not really happen in 1947, unlike the Bengal Assam or the East Pakistan and Assam boundary, right? Assam and East Pakistan boundaries also, it began to take shape between 1947 post 1950, right? And there would be disputes about forested areas, there would be dispute about the rivers, so many things happen. Unlike the West Bengal and the Punjab boundary, Punjab and the West Pakistan boundary, these remain little fuzzy, little more complex, and little less attended, if I am allowed to use this word, right, for a really long period of time. It was post 1950s, right, that I think the new political situations in the country, new economic circumstances, things began to take shape in a more clear way, right?
And what if we zoom into, say, one of the economies that you mentioned, like the jute economy, which was so huge? Can we talk about the transformations of that post-partition?
Right. You know, for few months and few years, Assam's jute economy virtually collapsed because jute really could not be exported in a safe and easy manner. There would be a lot of diplomatic and even military challenges from East Pakistan, right? There would be no railway wagon to transfer this jute. There would be obviously negotiations, right? The steamer companies also, they also not in a comfortable situations. Many of these European investors in the steamers and the railway companies, they also began to withdraw. So there is also a kind of substantial loopholes in the infrastructural investment whereby these commodities could be transferred. However, post 1950, the jute economy recovered because of the new diplomatic negotiations through which East Pakistan allowed the Indian jute to be exported to Calcutta. However, over a period of time, because of the distance, because of the taxations, and finally because of the 1965 war, post which Pakistan did not allow the further transmission of these goods from Assam side to the Calcutta port, right? Calcutta side, the jute export almost came to an end. However, in between, there are other kind of route communications. The railways came up by this time through North Bengal. But I think the cost of transport was much more higher now. Finally, by post 1970s, the production of jute, which actually was one of the biggest foreign revenue earners for Assam in 1947, post 1940s, post 1970, it has begun to decline and continue to decline. But there are other reasons also for this decline,
Right.
right? other kind of commercial alternative for jute by this time now.
Right, right. So that's very interesting. And I know that you have written quite a bit about the environment, about rivers and forests and land. Do you want to shed a little bit of light on some of the impacts on the natural areas at the time of partition, and maybe, indigenous peoples in the East?
Right. You have a very complex and tough question for
Yes,
me.
it's going to be very hard to summarize, but I thought maybe
Right.
you can shed a little bit of light in this short
But
program.
I think one of the key takeaway from your questions, right, it would be the way the resources were shared in these regions. Normally, environment should not be seen in a politically fragmented landscape, right? It should be
Right.
seen in a much more wider open landscape, right? So most of the troubles, whether it is a questions of floods or erosions or the trade in forest goods, right, or the mobility of the big mega mammals, right, elephants and other things, right, they need to be seen in a broader landscape. Because of the partitions, so because of this new the shape of geography post 1947, I think what we do, we began to see this in the animals, on the environments, right, quite exclusive to particular reasons, right? We don't try to connect the bigger environment, right, to our day-to-day sufferings, to day-to-day happenings. I think this is the lessons that I can think of, that this is quite important, right? For example, the questions of the human mobilities, right? Human mobility is such an important outcome of the environmental distress, right? That we need to think beyond this complex or fragmented landscape.
Yes, for sure. And do you have any other resources that you can tell our readers if they want to begin to learn about the impacts of, that transition, the 1947 and beyond transition from the colonial economy to modern, South Asian boundaries, where they
Right.
can learn, and if there's any other key points, key takeaways that they should keep in mind from our short conversation today?
Right. Obviously, as we began our discussion, right, much of our partition and post 1947 discussions feels around the Bengal and the Punjab story, right?
Right.
I think it is really important that we pay attention to this, particularly the hill uh, states of India's northeastern east, right? For example, Meghalaya, right, Mizoram, right? They were so crucial in the making of India's post-partition politics, right? Not only their day-to-day life, right, their identities, or much of their political developments post 1947s essentially centered around these hill areas, right? These hill areas suddenly got so isolated, so fragmented, right? That needs to be seen quite in a new perspective. Young generation of scholars, many students, really new scholarships are coming up around these regions, right? And more importantly, I think cross-border studies are also coming up quite comprehensively now, right?
Right.
Not only from Bangladesh perspective, not only from India perspective, but other areas, I think. And Indian archive particularly, post 1947, they are increasingly quite comprehensive. We get really good, very substantial, right, literary work, for example, not only the Bengali works, literature in Assam, the songs particularly, and the quite interesting oral narratives from particularly, say, the British officials who worked in Bengal or who worked in the hill districts of Assam. Many of their memoirs, right, they are really important to understand this complex period of 1947.
And they have some fascinating photographs too that a lot of the
Right.
British officers took, and they provide such an intriguing glimpse into
Absolutely.
the past.
Absolutely. You're really right, right. I think we should really pay attention to that. For example, the cinemas that were made in the 1950s from
Right.
this reason, right? They are really important. And I would say that literary archive, they are really fascinating for this particular period. I think we can really learn a lot from this literary archive.
Absolutely. Well, I wanted to thank you so much for joining us today. And I can't wait to learn even more. I think this is a great sort of first step glimpse for a lot of our audience members, many who are not aware of everything that happened in the Far East. As you know, the partition conversation is usually dominated by Punjab and Bengal. So thank you so much for your wonderful, life work and for educating all of us. And to our audience, please join us again tomorrow. And if you enjoyed today's program, please go ahead and give it a clap, as in a like, or a share if you're watching it on YouTube or Facebook. So thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing everybody again tomorrow.